Daniel Carter had always been a man of quiet resilience, a person who valued solitude and the steadiness of his land above all else. The farm was his escape, his sanctuary after the turbulence of the world outside. At 42, he had long given up the ambitions of a bustling city life, choosing instead the steady rhythm of the seasons, the growth of crops, and the occasional visits from his few neighbors. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving him with only memories and the field they had once worked together. The grief had not fully left him, but the land had a way of grounding his emotions. Each day was a new start, the work never ending, but always giving him a sense of purpose. He often walked the boundaries of his farm, making sure the fences were intact, the equipment well kept, and the crops were on track. It was a routine he had grown comfortable with, an unspoken connection between him and the earth he cultivated. The farm sat at the edge of a small, quiet town, nestled against the edge of a federal wildlife reserve. The land had been in his family for generations, handed down from his great-grandfather, and it held not only memories, but a deep sense of responsibility for its care. Daniel had never been one for excessive attention or noise. His life, though marked by loss, had found a strange form of peace in this unassuming corner of the world, but that peace was now being threatened by forces outside his control. It had started with something small, almost insignificant, an odd trail of tire marks leading from the edge of his field to the woods. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. The farm was close enough to the reserve that occasionally people would wander onto his property. He'd heard rumors of illegal hunting and poaching, and though he didn't like to admit it, he suspected some might be using his land to cross into the wilderness. But he didn't make a big deal out of it. He was accustomed to the occasional trespasser and usually just warned them off. After all, his farm was far removed from the main road, secluded enough that it was easy to lose track of the boundaries. But the tire marks continued. They appeared again the following week, but this time there were more of them. Heavier, deeper tracks, like the kind made by large vehicles or perhaps trucks. Then, one day, he found something strange on the edge of his field. A discarded firework shell. It wasn't the kind of firework you would buy in a store for a family barbecue. No, this was industrial-grade pyrotechnics, the kind that were used in large displays or illegal underground celebrations. It was a faint, lingering scent of gunpowder and the scorched remnants of the casing that gave it away. Daniel squatted by the shell, his mind racing with questions. Who would use his land for something like this? It wasn't like the people around here to engage in such reckless behavior. It was the sort of thing that happened in cities, not in a sleepy rural town like this. Still, he didn't make too much of it. People were always looking for places to hide their activities, and perhaps they were just testing the terrain for something bigger. He kicked the firework shell aside and went about his day, finishing up the tasks that had become second nature to him. But the unease lingered in the back of his mind. The sense that something wasn't quite right, that his peaceful life might not be as secure as he had believed. Days passed, and the unusual marks in the dirt became more frequent. The fireworks were becoming harder to ignore. Daniel, ever cautious, began to take more careful note of them. He even started to mark the places where the tire tracks appeared, drawing lines on a map he kept on the kitchen table. His suspicion grew that someone was using his property for something more serious than a casual misuse of land. But what? It wasn't long before his worst fears were realized. On the evening before the 4th of July, Daniel walked to the far edge of his farm, where his land met the Federal Reserve. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the grass as he inspected the fence. It had been an unusually hot summer, and the dry grass was crackling underfoot, the air thick with humidity. That's when he saw it. A flash of light, a burst of color in the distance. His heart sank as he realized what it was. Fireworks, huge ones, igniting just 100 yards away from the edge of his field. He had no idea who was doing it, but the spectacle was not something that belonged on his property. The fireworks shot into the sky, one after another, louder and more violent than anything he had ever seen before. It was a display, yes, but it wasn't a celebration. It was a blatant violation of the peace he had so carefully maintained. The smoke from the fireworks billowed across his property, and he knew instantly that this was no ordinary display. It was dangerously close to the dry underbrush of the reserve. His mind raced as the fireworks continued to explode in rapid succession. It only took one spark, one misfire, and the entire reserve could go up in flames. He had to act fast. Without wasting another second, Daniel ran to his truck, gunning the engine and speeding toward the edge of the property. He grabbed his cell phone and called 911, shouting at the dispatcher to send fire trucks immediately. His hand shook as he described the scene, the illegal fireworks, the proximity to the reserve, and the growing danger. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was almost too late. The fire had already spread to the edge of the reserve, and though the firemen managed to get it under control, it was clear that things could have gone much worse. The damage was significant, and the federal authorities were soon on the scene, coordinating with local law enforcement to assess the situation. Daniel stood off to the side, his heart still pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The federal agents interviewed him briefly, asking if he had seen anything suspicious in the area. He explained about the tire tracks, the fireworks shells, and the odd nature of the activity on his land, but they seemed uninterested in his suspicions. They had their own priorities, and Daniel was left standing in the background, an outsider in his own life. Yet, as he watched the agents survey the area, something gnawed at him. The fire had been stopped, but the larger question remained. Who was behind this, and what were they planning? As the fire was brought under control, Daniel realized that he couldn't ignore this anymore. His farm had been violated, his safety compromised, and now the risk to the reserve was more than just a threat. It was a reality, and as much as he longed to keep his life simple and isolated, he knew that he couldn't let this slide. Someone had used his land for their own gain, and he needed to find out who and why before it was too late. The peace he had taken for granted was gone, and it was up to him to get it back. In the days that followed, Daniel began to piece together what he had witnessed. He didn't know who was responsible for the fireworks, but he was certain that this was not the work of some random group of thrill-seekers. There were patterns here, a methodical approach that suggested something far more insidious than he had imagined. Daniel's farm was no longer just a place of quiet labor. It had become a battleground, and he was determined to fight for it. The stakes were high now, higher than he had ever expected, and the danger was real. The wheels of something much larger than he could have anticipated were already in motion, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him again. The morning after the fireworks had lit up the sky like a bomb exploding in the distance, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mind kept replaying the explosions, the deafening cracks that shattered the quiet of the night, the light that illuminated his field, and then the reserve beyond it. It felt like he had witnessed something far bigger than a random display of fireworks, and the unsettling thought that it was all part of a plan began to creep into his thoughts. The fire had been contained. Barely, but what had started as a small spark in the dry grass had quickly turned into a massive threat, one that could have easily spread across the entire reserve, destroying not only the wildlife but also the fragile ecosystem that had taken years to build. That night, Daniel had barely been able to sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't answer. Who would target a place like this? Who would use his land as a base for illegal fireworks? And why would they do it so close to the reserve, where the consequences of a fire could be catastrophic? The next morning, he couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed his coat and boots, knowing he had to get out to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. He had to be sure of what had happened, even if it meant retracing his steps from the night before. The familiar routine of his farm didn't soothe him the way it usually did. Instead, there was an unfamiliar restlessness gnawing at him, the feeling that everything had changed. The quiet, peaceful life he had cultivated for years was no longer enough. There was someone out there, and Daniel had a sinking suspicion that if he didn't act now, he would regret it. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Daniel walked to the edge of his property. He stepped carefully over the dry, cracked earth, trying not to disturb the land too much. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to find something. His eyes scanned the field, the trees, and the hills beyond, where the reserve started. He hadn't noticed much the night before, distracted by the chaos of the fireworks and the threat of fire. But now, in the daylight, everything seemed different. There were signs, subtle ones, that something had been here. Tire tracks, deeper than normal, were etched into the dirt. They had driven onto his field, directly into the path he usually took when inspecting the property. The tracks seemed fresh, but the morning dew had already begun to settle, masking the exact depth of the marks. There was a trail, though, leading into the woods, where the underbrush was sparse enough to allow vehicles to pass through. Daniel followed the trail cautiously, each step careful but deliberate. His heart was pounding in his chest, a tight knot of anxiety twisting with each breath. He knew he had to find answers, but as the distance between him and his house grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. This was no longer about a few wayward travelers trespassing across his land. There was a deliberate intent here, a sense of purpose that made Daniel's stomach turn. When he reached the woods, the trail ended abruptly. The trees were dense here, their branches thick enough to block out the light, but there were no signs of anything unusual, nothing that would explain the fireworks or the vehicles. Still, something about the area felt different, as though it was hiding something just beyond his reach. He crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt, searching for anything that might give him a clue. Then, as he brushed aside some leaves and debris, his hand landed on something hard. He froze for a moment, heart racing, before he carefully pulled the object from the ground. It was a discarded fireworks shell, the kind that was typically used for professional displays, large and metal with a heavy casing. Daniel turned it over in his hands, studying it closely. The outer surface was scorched, likely from a failed launch or an accidental misfire. The remnants of a fuse were still attached to one side, charred and blackened. This was no child's toy, no amateur setup. This was deliberate. It was the same kind of firework that had been used the night before, the kind that could cause a fire big enough to burn down the entire reserve. Daniel's pulse quickened as the implications hit him. This wasn't just reckless behavior. It was something more sinister. Someone had intentionally used his land to set up a dangerous, illegal display that could have wiped out the entire area. The sinking feeling in his stomach intensified, and he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. He stood up, brushing off his hands and scanning the surroundings once more. He had to act quickly, but he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, and he wasn't sure who to turn to. The local authorities, sure, but would they take him seriously? Would they even care? This was no small issue. It involved federal land, a potential wildfire, and, now, a series of increasingly bizarre events that pointed to a much larger conspiracy. Daniel didn't want to involve the police if it wasn't absolutely necessary. He had grown up in this town, and he had always kept to himself, not wanting to stir the pot. But he also knew that things had escalated past the point of being able to handle it quietly. It wasn't just his land anymore. His neighbors were at risk, the town was at risk, and the reserve was a national treasure that couldn't be ignored. He had no choice but to take it further. He walked back to his house, deep in thought, the fireworks shell still clutched tightly in his hand. As he reached the porch, he stopped and looked around. The world seemed unchanged, as it always did when he returned home from a morning walk. The smell of fresh coffee wafted from the kitchen window, and the rooster crowed in the distance. But everything was different now. He couldn't ignore the signs, the clues, the feeling of something far more dangerous moving under the surface. He had been too comfortable for too long, and now the land he had once trusted to remain untouched had become a battleground, one that he didn't know how to win. Inside, Daniel placed the fireworks shell on the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't have the answers, but he knew where to start. He reached for the phone and dialed the number of the local fire marshal, hoping to speak with someone who could help him make sense of what was happening. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Fire Marshal Callahan here." "I need your help," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "There's something going on here. Something dangerous. I think someone's using my land for illegal fireworks, and I'm worried it could lead to something worse." The conversation that followed was short but telling. Fire Marshal Callahan promised to send someone out to investigate, but there was a hesitation in his voice, a reluctance to fully engage. Daniel knew that the fire marshal didn't want to get involved in something that could be bigger than they both realized, but it was already too late to turn back. He hung up the phone and sat down, staring at the fireworks shell on the table, his thoughts swirling in confusion and fear. There was no going back from this. The chain of events had already begun, and Daniel was caught in the middle. The fire had been stopped, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had just begun to scratch the surface, and he had no idea what would come next. But whatever it was, Daniel knew he had to be ready. The farm that had once been his refuge, his escape from the world, had now become a battlefield, and he was the only one who could defend it. It wasn't just his land at stake anymore. It was everything. The following days after Daniel's call to the fire marshal were tense. The winds of uncertainty hung heavily over him, a silent weight pressing down with every step he took on his farm. The fireworks, the strange tire tracks, the fire that nearly tore through the heart of the reserve. All of it clung to his thoughts like an ominous shadow, waiting to pounce. He hadn't yet heard back from Fire Marshal Callahan, but Daniel was no longer content to wait idly. He knew the authorities had their own pace, but this was his land, his livelihood, and he wasn't about to let it slip away because of someone's recklessness, or worse, their malicious intentions. The farm had been his sanctuary for years, a place of healing, hard work, and solitude after the death of his wife. It was more than just land to him. It was where he had rebuilt his life, where he had found his sense of purpose again. To let it be destroyed by forces outside his control was something Daniel couldn't stomach. It was a Friday morning when things truly escalated. The air was thick with humidity, the sky a low, oppressive gray that threatened rain. Daniel had spent the morning checking the perimeter of his property again, walking the same worn path along the fence line, tracing his steps through the tall grass, feeling the rough texture of the field beneath his boots. He didn't expect to find anything new, just the occasional rustle of wildlife in the distance, the chirp of birds, the buzzing of insects. But as he approached the edge of his land near the woods, something caught his eye. It wasn't the usual debris, the scattered branches or leaves that always accumulated after a storm. No, this was deliberate. It was too methodical. A metal object, half buried in the underbrush, gleamed faintly in the dim light. Daniel's instincts told him to approach with caution, and as he got closer he could see the edges of the object more clearly. His heart sank as he recognized what it was, an industrial fireworks shell, still partially intact, though clearly damaged. The fuse was singed, the casing cracked, and it was far larger than the ones he had seen in the previous weeks. It wasn't just a stray firework. It was the kind of device used in large-scale professional displays, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He crouched down beside it, his fingers brushing the edges of the shell, a chill running down his spine. The discovery made everything feel more real. This wasn't a random event. Someone had been systematically using his land for something far more insidious. The fireworks weren't just a nuisance, they were part of something bigger, something that Daniel didn't fully understand yet, but he knew enough to recognize that it had the potential to destroy everything he had worked for. His farm, the land he had cared for all these years, had been turned into a testing ground for dangerous explosives. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. Daniel stood up quickly, scanning the area around him, but the woods remained still and silent. There was no movement in the trees, no sign of anyone nearby. He listened closely, but the sound of the vehicle grew fainter, as if whoever was driving it was leaving. He felt a twinge of irritation. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard like this. He quickly made his way back to his truck, keeping an eye on the horizon. He wasn't sure who was behind all of this, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep waiting for the authorities to act. This was his responsibility now. When Daniel got to his truck, he pulled out his phone and dialed Fire Marshal Callahan's number again. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no politeness. The urgency was palpable as he explained everything: the fireworks, the tire tracks, the discovery of the fireworks shell in the woods. "I don't know how long I can hold this off," Daniel said, his voice strained. "You need to send someone out here, and soon. This isn't just a matter of some kids playing with fireworks, it's something far worse." There was a long pause on the other end, and Daniel's impatience grew. He could hear muffled voices in the background before the marshal finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to be honest with you. I've got my hands full right now with the fire department, and I don't have the manpower to send someone your way immediately. But I'll see what I can do. You said you found more fireworks? Are you sure they're illegal?" Daniel clenched his jaw, his frustration boiling over. "I'm sure. These are professional grade. If someone doesn't stop this soon, we're going to have another fire on our hands. A much bigger one. You need to take this seriously. I'll have someone come by to check things out, but right now, I can't promise anything. Just keep your distance, all right? Don't engage with anyone." The line went dead, and Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. The authorities were bogged down with bigger cases, and even if they came, how long would it take them to figure out who was behind this? Daniel wasn't going to sit by and watch his farm burn down while they tried to piece it all together. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The rest of the day passed in a haze of restlessness. Daniel continued his usual chores, checking the livestock, maintaining the equipment, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the conversation with Callahan, the words echoing in his mind. "Keep your distance." That was easier said than done when your home, your livelihood, was under threat. By evening, the anxiety in his chest had grown unbearable, and Daniel knew he had to act. He couldn't keep waiting for someone to show up. The threat was real, and it was on his land. That night, as darkness settled over the farm, Daniel decided to take matters into his own hands. He grabbed a flashlight, strapped on his boots, and walked out into the night, determined to find out what was really going on. The air was thick and still, the kind of summer night that felt as if the world was holding its breath. He followed the path to the woods again, scanning the area with the flashlight, his mind racing. What he found wasn't just more firework debris. No, this time it was different. This time there were remnants of chemicals, tubes that looked like they had been used for some sort of makeshift bomb, and faint traces of what seemed like accelerants. Whoever had been here wasn't just playing with fireworks. They were preparing for something bigger, something far more dangerous. Daniel felt his stomach drop as he pieced it all together. The fireworks were just a front. This was an organized effort, and whoever was behind it had no regard for the safety of the land or the people around it. He had been right to trust his instincts. This wasn't just some kids causing trouble. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. And now, Daniel had become part of their plan, whether he liked it or not. As he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of what could only be described as a disaster waiting to happen, Daniel realized that he couldn't fight this alone. It was bigger than him, and he needed help. But who could he trust? He had to make some tough decisions. It wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about stopping something far more dangerous before it destroyed everything he had worked so hard to protect. He turned back toward the house, his mind already formulating a plan. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following week was filled with quiet moments of waiting, but underneath the surface, Daniel felt the tension building like a storm ready to break. His farm had always been a place of peace and solitude, but now it had become a battlefield. Every creak of the wind through the trees, every distant sound of machinery in the fields made him jump, wondering if it was someone coming to continue the chaos that had been unleashed on his property. Though Fire Marshal Callahan had promised to send someone to investigate, Daniel had heard nothing from the authorities. The weeks seemed to stretch on without any real resolution. He knew something had to be done, and soon, but he couldn't act recklessly. This wasn't something that could be solved by just chasing down a few stray trespassers. Whoever was behind this was organized, methodical, and had access to resources far beyond a handful of miscreants lighting off fireworks. One evening, after another long day of inspecting his fields and trying to manage the growing unease in his chest, Daniel found himself sitting on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with fiery streaks of orange and pink, the kind of view he used to share with Sarah, the kind of peaceful moment he used to cherish. But tonight, the sunset only made him feel more isolated, as though the world was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. His thoughts returned to the fireworks shell he had discovered on his land, the metal casing still lingering in his mind, its significance more chilling with each passing day. Something told him that this was just the beginning, that there was more at play here than he could fully grasp. The phone call came late that night. Daniel had been about to turn in for the evening when the shrill sound of his cell phone startled him out of his thoughts. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway, hoping it was someone who could finally offer answers, or at least some form of reassurance. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said. "This is Deputy Adams with the sheriff's office. I need to talk to you about something important." Daniel sat up straighter, his heart skipping a beat. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've been investigating the reports of illegal fireworks on your property," the deputy continued. "We've got some intel that suggests there's more going on than we initially thought. We need to meet with you as soon as possible." Daniel's pulse quickened. The words, illegal fireworks, had taken on a new meaning now, something far darker than he had ever imagined. "What do you mean, more going on? Is it the same people?" "That's the problem," Deputy Adams said, his voice dropping slightly. "We've traced some of the activity back to a company called Blackwood Industries. They've been involved in some illegal land development and have ties to some shady characters who are known for fire starting in the area. I don't know all the details yet, but we're investigating." Blackwood Industries. Daniel had never heard of them before, but something about the name felt wrong. The company's reputation seemed to carry an air of secrecy, the kind of company that worked in the shadows, away from public scrutiny. It made sense now, he thought. The fireworks, the tire tracks, the chemicals he'd found. This wasn't just a random group of people causing trouble. This was something bigger, something that involved real estate, land, and possibly more malicious intent than he had originally considered. "When do you want to meet?" Daniel asked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Tomorrow." "We'll be at the sheriff's office at noon. I'll explain everything then. Just be careful, Mr. Carter. This could be more dangerous than you realize." The call ended with a click, and Daniel was left alone with the weight of the information hanging over him. Blackwood Industries. The name echoed in his mind as he stared out at the vast expanse of his farm. It seemed impossible to think that something so massive, so corrupt, could have infiltrated his quiet corner of the world. But everything he had seen in the past few weeks, the fireworks, the tire tracks, the strange activity on his property, now painted a picture of something far more sinister. It was no longer just about protecting his farm. Now it was about stopping whatever Blackwood Industries had planned, whatever they were trying to do with his land. The next morning was heavy with anticipation. Daniel barely slept, his thoughts spinning around the meeting he had scheduled with Deputy Adams. He felt a nervous energy in his stomach, the kind of feeling that told him that this was the moment when everything would change. He had to get to the sheriff's office and figure out exactly what was happening. The clock seemed to drag on endlessly as he finished his chores and packed up for the meeting. By the time noon rolled around, he found himself sitting across from Deputy Adams in a sterile white room in the sheriff's office, the air thick with tension. Adams, a man in his early 40s with a rough but weathered look, didn't waste any time. He pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward Daniel. "Take a look at this," he said, his voice low. Daniel opened the folder, and as he scanned the documents, his stomach twisted. There were maps, photos, and records, everything he had suspected, and much more. The first page contained a detailed map of the region, with several marked areas of interest, including Daniel's property. The photos showed aerial views of the land, the fields, and, closer to the Federal Reserve, areas that had been scorched by fire. But the most chilling part was the series of documents that listed Blackwood Industries' acquisition of nearby lands, all of which seemed to coincide with areas that had suffered from fires in the last few years. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel muttered, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. "What does Blackwood have to do with all this? What are they doing with this land?" Adams sighed, clearly frustrated. "We don't know yet. But it looks like Blackwood Industries has been buying up parcels of land near the Federal Reserve for years now, mostly in secret. There's a pattern here: fires, land clearing, and then sudden purchases. We believe they've been using illegal means to force people off their land, and it looks like your farm is next." Daniel felt his heart drop. His farm, his sanctuary, the land that had been in his family for generations. "What do you mean, next? They're trying to take my land." "They're trying to take more than that," Adams said, his voice grim. "We believe Blackwood is trying to acquire large swaths of land in the area to build a private development. They've been using intimidation tactics, including arson and other illegal methods to force people to sell. We're not sure how they're doing it yet, but we think the fireworks were a diversion. A way to start the fires without drawing too much attention. Your farm was used as a test ground, but now they've moved on to bigger things." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was being targeted by a corporation with too much power and far too many resources. His suspicions had been right. This wasn't just a random string of events, it was a deliberate effort to manipulate the land for financial gain. And now, Daniel was standing in the middle of it, caught between the forces trying to destroy his life and the growing realization that his peaceful existence had been shattered beyond repair. He stood up suddenly, his mind racing. What do we do now? Adams looked up at him, his eyes narrowing. We need to keep this quiet for now. The more people know, the harder it will be to stop them. But we've got to act fast. We're building a case, but it's going to take time. If you're willing to cooperate, we can try to turn this thing around. But you have to be careful. Blackwood is a powerful company, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Daniel's head was spinning. He had come to the sheriff's office looking for answers, but now he was even more entrenched in the fight than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about fighting a battle that had been brewing for years, a battle against a company that had more money, more resources, and far more influence than he could have ever expected. The weight of the task ahead hung heavily on him as he left the sheriff's office. The battle had just begun, and Daniel knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The days following his meeting with Deputy Adams were a blur of uncertainty and action. Daniel spent the next week on edge, his mind racing with thoughts of Blackwood Industries and the sinister plan that seemed to be unfolding right beneath his feet. He had always thought of his farm as a sanctuary, a place where he could live at peace with the land, but now it felt like a battleground, a place of constant vigilance, where every creak of the wind or distant sound of a truck meant the possibility of something dark and dangerous approaching. He kept himself busy with his usual tasks, the rhythm of the farm grounding him in the midst of the chaos swirling around him. He fixed fences, checked irrigation systems, tended to the animals, but all the while his eyes were on the horizon, always searching for something, anything, that would give him a sign of what was coming next. Daniel had decided to trust Deputy Adams, even though he knew it wasn't a guarantee that the authorities would be able to stop Blackwood's plans in time. He had already seen the bureaucracy of law enforcement firsthand, how slow and cumbersome it could be, and he knew that the wheels of justice often moved at a frustrating pace. But he had to believe that something could be done. He had no choice. The alternative was to let Blackwood destroy everything he had worked for, to let them take his land, his home, and his future. And Daniel wasn't prepared to give that up without a fight. The first sign that things were about to escalate came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a few days after the meeting with Adams. Daniel was at the far end of his property, near the wooded area where he had found the remnants of the fireworks the week before, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. At first, he thought it was just another passing truck or someone from the town, but the vehicle didn't slow down as it approached his gate. Instead, it sped up, its engine growling louder as it got closer. Daniel's hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his shoulder. He had always kept a weapon close at hand. Out here in the wilderness, it was more for protection from wildlife than anything else, but in the past few weeks he had grown more and more wary of who might be lurking on his land. As the truck neared, Daniel's heart began to race. It wasn't a local vehicle. The truck was dark, with tinted windows that obscured the driver's face. It was big, a heavy-duty model, and it had the unmistakable markings of a construction company on the side. The logo was smudged, partially obscured by a layer of dirt and grime, but Daniel could make out enough to see that it wasn't a company he recognized. The truck slowed as it passed his gate, and Daniel's eyes narrowed. It wasn't unusual for contractors to pass through this area. They sometimes worked on nearby farms or did maintenance on the roads, but there was something about the truck that felt wrong. He watched it as it passed, noting the license plate number in his mind, but before he could move, the truck suddenly swerved off the road and onto a dirt path leading toward the back of his property. His heart skipped a beat. The truck was heading directly toward the area where he had found the fireworks. He knew deep down that this was no coincidence. He had suspected for days that someone was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike, but now it seemed clear that they were making their move. Daniel's mind raced. He didn't have time to waste. He couldn't just wait for the authorities to show up. The truck was heading straight into his land, and he had no idea what the people inside intended to do. He moved quickly, ducking behind a nearby tree, trying to stay out of sight. From his vantage point, he could see the truck come to a halt near the woods, just a few hundred yards from where he had discovered the firework debris. The doors of the truck opened, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in heavy-duty work gear, but something about their movements didn't sit right with Daniel. They didn't look like construction workers. The men moved quickly, scanning the area around them before heading toward the woods. Daniel's stomach churned. He knew that this wasn't just about fireworks anymore. These men were here for something else, something bigger. He had to act fast. Without thinking, Daniel sprinted toward his truck, grabbing his phone and dialing Deputy Adams' number. His hands shook as he waited for the call to connect. The seconds felt like hours. When Adams finally picked up, Daniel didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need help," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "There are two men on my property right now, and I think they're here to do something illegal. I don't know who they are, but they're heading toward the woods where I found the fireworks. You need to send someone out here now." Adams' voice was calm but tinged with concern. "Stay where you are, Daniel. I'll get someone out there. Keep your distance. Don't try to confront them." Daniel's teeth gritted together as he clicked off the phone. He didn't have time to wait for someone else to show up. He had to do something himself. He grabbed his rifle, double-checking that it was loaded, and moved toward the woods. His pulse was racing, and every step felt like a giant leap into the unknown. The men had already disappeared into the trees, but Daniel was determined to find them, to stop whatever they were planning before it was too late. As he neared the woods, Daniel's senses were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt amplified, and he moved silently, careful not to give away his position. The area around him was quiet, eerily so, and for a moment he wondered if he was walking into a trap. His mind raced with possibilities. What if this wasn't just about fireworks? What if these men were here to steal something? Or worse, what if they were here to destroy his farm completely? Daniel reached the spot where he had last seen the men. The trees were thick here, and the light was dim, casting long shadows across the ground. He crouched low, trying to keep himself hidden, but the sight that met his eyes nearly made him freeze in his tracks. The two men were standing in front of a large, makeshift structure that Daniel hadn't noticed before, a small, nondescript shack built into the edge of the forest. It looked out of place, like something that had been constructed hastily, and it was clear that it hadn't been there long. One of the men was holding a large container of chemicals, while the other was setting up more fireworks, arranging them carefully along the edge of the structure. Daniel's mind raced as he pieced together what he was seeing. They were preparing something big, something dangerous, and they were using his land to do it. He had to stop them, but he couldn't do it alone. With his heart pounding in his chest, Daniel backed away slowly, keeping his eyes on the men as he made his way back toward his truck. He needed to get to safety, to gather his thoughts, and to figure out his next move. By the time he reached his truck, he was out of breath, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. He dialed Deputy Adams again, his voice tight with urgency. "They're setting up something. Fireworks, chemicals, I don't know, but it's bad. You need to send someone out here now, before they finish whatever they're doing." Adams' voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the concern underneath. "I'm on it, Daniel. Stay put. Help is on the way." Daniel didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his gear and headed toward the spot where the men had been, knowing that he couldn't afford to waste any more time. When he arrived, the structure was quiet. Too quiet. He carefully approached, rifle at the ready, scanning the area for any signs of movement. But there was no one in sight. The men were gone. Daniel's mind raced. Had they seen him? Had they run off? Or had they finished whatever they had come to do? The structure was still there, standing silently in the woods, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. His stomach churned as he scanned the area, his thoughts racing. This wasn't over. He knew that. Whatever these men were planning, it was far from finished. He had to keep pushing, keep fighting to protect his land, and he couldn't afford to wait for someone else to take the lead. The battle had only just begun, and Daniel knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The tension in the air had reached a breaking point by the time Daniel arrived back at his farm that evening. He stood outside his truck, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The men, the chemicals, the makeshift structure in the woods. He couldn't shake the images from his mind. Every detail, every moment, seemed to fit into a much larger puzzle that was rapidly unfolding, and yet Daniel couldn't put all the pieces together. His thoughts raced faster than his legs could carry him as he walked back toward the house, but something was different now. It wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It wasn't just about defending the farm that had been his sanctuary for so many years. He had become a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The moment he reached the front door, his phone buzzed in his pocket. His pulse quickened as he pulled it out and saw Deputy Adams' name on the screen. Daniel answered it immediately, holding his breath as he waited for the deputy's voice to come through the speaker. "Daniel, it's Adams," came the voice, tight and urgent. "I've got some bad news. We've been tracking Blackwood Industries for a while now, and we've got confirmation that they've been using illegal means to force people off their land. They've got people in place to buy up property at a bargain, land that's been made uninhabitable through fires or other damage. I'm afraid your farm is next, but there's more." Daniel's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "What more?" "I've been working with the state fire marshal, and we've just gotten intel. Blackwood is planning something big. They've been orchestrating these accidents, the fireworks, the fires, right under our noses. And they've got an entire operation set up. They're using your farm as a testing ground, Daniel. I don't think this is just about taking the land. It's part of a larger scheme." A cold wave of dread washed over Daniel. What are they planning? "There's going to be a fire," Adams replied, his voice full of grim realization. "But it won't just be an ordinary fire. They've been stockpiling chemicals. The fire they plan to set will be catastrophic. If we don't stop them, it'll be too late." The words hung heavy in the air as Daniel processed the deputy's revelation. They were planning to destroy his farm, not just through fire but with something far worse, something that would ensure it was uninhabitable for good. The land he had worked so hard to protect, the land that had been passed down from generation to generation, was being systematically destroyed by a company with no regard for the people who lived there. "Where are they now?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the chaos roiling inside him. "I don't know yet," Adams said, "but we need to move fast. I've got a team en route, but I don't know how long we have." Daniel's mind was already working in overdrive, each second that passed pushing him closer to action. He couldn't afford to wait for a team that might not even get there in time. He had to act now, before Blackwood's plan could come to fruition. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either fall apart or be saved. He grabbed his rifle, his boots, and his gear, knowing that the next few hours would define everything. He raced back to the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. The entire forest seemed to close in around him as he ran, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The trees that had once been so familiar now felt like an endless maze, each turn a step closer to something dangerous. He knew Blackwood wasn't just in the woods. He could feel it, the deep sense that he was being watched. As he reached the clearing where the makeshift structure had been, his flashlight flickered and then steadied, casting long shadows across the ground. The scene was eerily quiet, but there was something about it that didn't feel right. Suddenly, Daniel heard the sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps to be a coincidence. He quickly dropped to the ground, his heart racing, and peered through the underbrush. The men from Blackwood were back, but this time they weren't alone. They were moving quickly, setting up equipment, securing something with ropes, and placing more of the chemical containers near the edge of the clearing. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he realized what they were doing. They were preparing to ignite a fire, and this time it was going to be massive. He had no choice. He had to stop them. With one final glance at the men, Daniel sprinted toward the truck. His hands were shaking as he started the engine, his mind focused only on the task at hand. He had to get to the structure before they finished whatever they were doing. He raced through the woods, his headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he navigated the winding path toward the clearing. As he neared the spot, he saw the men in the distance moving with purpose, oblivious to his approach. He slammed the brakes just in time to stop near the edge of the clearing. He was close enough now. Too close. Daniel knew he couldn't just charge in. He had to be smart, had to use the element of surprise. He grabbed his rifle, checking it one last time before slipping out of the truck. He crouched low to the ground, keeping his body hidden behind the brush. The men were focused on their work, unaware of his presence. He moved slowly, carefully, making sure each step was quiet, each breath controlled. When he was close enough to hear their voices, Daniel felt the anger in his chest rise. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. These men weren't just criminals. They were destroying everything that had once been sacred to him. They were robbing him of his legacy, and he wasn't going to let that happen. With one swift motion, Daniel stood and raised his rifle. He aimed it at the ground near the structure, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Stop right there," he called out, the words carrying through the silence. The men froze, turning toward him with a mix of confusion and surprise. Daniel's heart was pounding in his chest, but his voice didn't waver. He knew he had the advantage now. They had no idea who he was, no idea that he had been watching them for days, and he wasn't about to let them get away with what they were doing. One of the men stepped forward, hands raised, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, man, we don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm but tinged with fear. "We're just doing our job." "Your job?" Daniel's voice was icy, his grip tightening on the rifle. "You're not just doing your job. You're destroying everything I've worked for. You're putting lives at risk, and you're going to pay for it." The second man looked nervously over his shoulder at the structure. "Listen, we don't want any trouble either, all right? We're just doing what we're told. This isn't our decision." "I don't care who's telling you to do this," Daniel said, taking a step forward. "You're not leaving here until the authorities get here." The first man's eyes flickered with unease, and Daniel could see the hesitation in his movements. But just as he was about to speak again, the sound of sirens split the air, a welcome sound that made Daniel's heart skip a beat. The cavalry had arrived. Within minutes, the clearing was swarming with police, fire marshals, and federal agents. The men from Blackwood were arrested, their plans exposed for all to see. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle still in hand, watching as the agents secured the area and began their investigation. The fire that had been waiting to ignite was now contained, the chemicals being carefully removed by the fire marshals. As he watched everything unfold, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and anger. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. Blackwood had been stopped, but their plans weren't over. He knew that. But for the first time in weeks, Daniel allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. He had fought for his land, for his future, and he had won. But, deep down, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. The forces behind Blackwood were still out there, still operating in the shadows, and the fight wasn't over. But for now, he could breathe. For now, the farm was safe. The calm that followed the chaos of the past few weeks settled over Daniel like a heavy blanket, one that he didn't realize he had been carrying until it was finally lifted. The officers and federal agents were still on his property, carefully sifting through the evidence and taking down notes, but for the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to relax, even if only for a moment. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the immediate danger had passed. The men from Blackwood Industries had been arrested, their plans exposed for everyone to see. They had come to his farm, thinking they could manipulate and destroy everything he had worked so hard for, but they had underestimated him. Daniel had fought back, and for once, he had won. The sheriff, a tall, stern man named Jake Henderson, came up to Daniel as he stood near the edge of his property, watching the officers finish their work. "You did good, Carter," Henderson said, his voice rough but sincere. "You kept your head when it mattered. Most people would have just let it slide or called the cops, but you took action." Daniel nodded, still processing everything that had happened. His mind felt foggy, as if the adrenaline that had been coursing through him for days was now wearing off, leaving him exhausted. "I just didn't know what else to do," he said quietly. "I couldn't let them take it. Not without a fight." Henderson glanced at the agents who were still working, then back at Daniel. "You did more than just fight. You made sure they couldn't do it. That's something most people wouldn't have the guts to do. It wasn't just about saving your farm either. You stopped them from doing this to anyone else." Daniel didn't respond at first. His eyes lingered on the wreckage of the makeshift structure in the woods, the spot where the men had been setting up their dangerous scheme. It was hard to believe that something so sinister had been brewing so close to home. But it wasn't just the fireworks and the chemicals that bothered him. It was the realization that Blackwood Industries had been working in the shadows for so long, buying up land, manipulating people, and creating chaos to suit their plans. They weren't just a company. They were a machine, operating with a level of secrecy and power that Daniel had never fully understood. And he knew that while this fight had been won, the larger battle was still out there, lurking in the background, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. "Where do we go from here?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "They're not just going to give up, are they?" Henderson let out a heavy sigh. "No, they won't. Not that easily. But you've got the ball in your court now. You've got evidence, witnesses, and the law on your side. What you did here, Carter, is going to make it a lot harder for them to operate like this in the future. You didn't just protect your land. You protected everyone else in this community who could have been next." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Daniel didn't need anyone to tell him that this fight wasn't over. He knew it in his gut. Blackwood Industries wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. The company had too much money, too many resources to let one failed attempt stop them. But, for now, Daniel had won. His farm was still his, and the land that had been threatened was safe, at least for the time being. And that was something. Over the next few days, the town of Pine Ridge slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though there was an undeniable shift in the air. People whispered about what had happened on Daniel's property, about the men from Blackwood and their plans. But the mood was different now. It was no longer about fear or uncertainty. It was about pride. People were proud of what Daniel had done. They had seen the kind of man he was, the kind of man who wouldn't back down when the stakes were high, who wouldn't let anyone take what was rightfully his, no matter the cost. In a town like Pine Ridge, that kind of courage was rare, and it didn't go unnoticed. Daniel found himself at the local diner one morning, sipping coffee and listening to the hum of conversation around him. It was quieter than usual, but there was a certain warmth in the air. He had always kept to himself, preferring the solitude of his farm over the bustle of town life, but now it felt different. There was a new sense of camaraderie, of respect, that he hadn't experienced before. People nodded at him as he walked in, giving him small smiles of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that the town had his back. At the counter, Mary, the waitress who had worked at the diner for as long as anyone could remember, came over to refill his coffee. She had a kind smile, one that didn't often show much emotion, but today she seemed different. There was a softness in her eyes as she set the coffee pot down in front of him. "People around here don't forget someone who stands up for what's right," Mary said, her voice gentle but firm. "You did a good thing, Daniel. Not just for you, but for all of us." Daniel met her gaze, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I didn't do it for the recognition. Just had to protect what's mine." Mary nodded. "We all have something worth protecting." As she walked away, Daniel sat back in his seat, taking a moment to appreciate the quiet, simple life he had fought so hard to preserve. The farm was still standing, the land still his, and the fight wasn't over yet. But for now, he could take a breath, knowing that he had done everything in his power to keep his world intact. The sheriff's office had already begun its investigation into Blackwood Industries, and the federal agents were handling the legal aspects. As the weeks went by, more information came to light. Blackwood's operation wasn't as hidden as they had hoped. The company's ties to illegal land grabs, fraudulent claims, and bribery were slowly being exposed. The evidence Daniel had provided, the photos, the chemicals, the documents found in the makeshift structure, was enough to launch a full-scale investigation. But even as the legal system began to take its course, Daniel knew that this wasn't the end. Blackwood would fight back. They had too much at stake, too many resources. But now, the town of Pine Ridge had something they didn't: awareness. They had seen what Blackwood was capable of, and they weren't going to let it happen again. In the weeks following the arrest of the Blackwood employees, Daniel's farm became a symbol of resistance. People from neighboring towns came to visit, to see for themselves the land that had been protected, the farm that had stood up to a powerful corporation and won. They brought their support, their resources, and in return, Daniel shared his story. He wasn't a hero, he often said. He was just a man trying to keep what was his. But the people who came to him saw something more than that. They saw a man who fought for what he believed in, a man who refused to let the world change him. Daniel didn't know what the future would hold.